Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business Innovation and Managing Life Q&A. So we have a number of questions saved up from our most recent, our most recent but one session. The question here from Fire: how do you keep track of all the information you have reviewed, from articles to journals to emails to books? Okay, reasonable question. I think about that a lot. I look at many things and it's like I learn some interesting fact, I see some interesting piece of material, what do I do with it? I would say that the number one thing that I try to do is I try to have buckets for every project that I think I'm going to do. So at any given time, there maybe are a few tens of such buckets. And when I see something that is relevant to one of those buckets, I throw that thing in there. And I throw it in there in a perhaps not terribly organized way, because I know that when I'm actually going to do that project, I'm perfectly happy to go through and look at what was there that I've been accumulating maybe for 10 years, 20 years, whatever. As it happens, just last night, I was, there's a particular drawer right behind my desk that has been accumulating stuff for, as it turns out, about 20 years. I didn't really know how long it had been accumulating stuff. And for various reasons, I wanted to look through some things that had been accumulating there. Actually, I realized there are things that have been accumulating there about our physics project. And by golly, we've done the big stage of that project. And so I looked through that drawer just last night, and there were things there from 2004 that were sort of pre-pieces of that project. Now, actually, that was a failure because I hadn't looked at that drawer since 2004. So those were things which I had prepared for that project. But when I got to do that project, I didn't know to look for them. And in fact, forgot for 2 years to look for them. So, and the reason that happened is because I didn't really have an organized bucket in which to put things for that project, because that project was too far in the future. But in general, the thing that works for me is where there's something I think I'm going to do, it's, I throw anything I find that's relevant to that into that particular bucket, so that when I am ready to really actively do the project, I can go through and look at it. Now, it wouldn't work if I had thousands of these buckets, because I'd never remember what buckets there were. I have to have a few tens of them. And typically what I do, I would say that my favorite way of doing that is just have it in my file system. And I also have some email folders that I throw things into. I have to say I'm trying to discontinue that practice. And I have some code that is almost ready that will take folders from email and turn them into Orphan notebooks, turn the content of that folder into an Orphan notebook in a nice organized way so that I can just store that notebook in a file system. So when that project becomes active, I will look at what's there in the file system. And that, I think, is going to be a better system for doing that. Now, as far as just random things where I say, oh, that's kind of interesting, I don't really have a place to put it. Honestly, that's always a challenging thing. I have a things to read folder, and which I expect to bring up when I'm kind of waiting for something, standing in a line somewhere. I've just got my phone. I'm going to bring it up. I have it in in Dropbox or whatever, and I'm going to bring up that folder, and then I'm going to say, well, what is there that I can just randomly read because I've got a few minutes to read something. Since I haven't been out and about in the world and traveling and having times where I'm just sort of waiting for things much in the last couple of years, my things to read collection has mostly just gotten longer and longer. And those are sort of undifferentiated, unbucketed things. I think that I also have, I get books and things. Books, sometimes I'll buy a hardcover book or a printed book just for the sake of reminding me that this is something I wanted to look at. And because it will sit somewhere, and I have a specific shelves actually, that in fact I have some shelves right here that are specifically my holding pen for books that I'm kind of intending to look at before they get put into my long-term shelving. So in terms of, for example, for books, I have maybe, I don't know how many it is now, 8,000 or so books. They're all categorized. They're all on shelves in particular places. When I want to think about a particular topic, I'll go and look at the shelves about that topic. And I have to say, I'm continually I find it very interesting. I've got a lot of very interesting books. Maybe someday I'll do some live streams and just sort of go and survey some books that I have. But for me, it's very useful. I've got some topic I'm looking at, and I'll go look at the books I have on that topic. And it's like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of interesting books there. I'd forgotten I had those. It's the same thing in my online buckets. It's things like, I've got these interesting things. I just have to be reminded of them at the time when that project is going to become active. Now, as far as other things are concerned, like, for example, with email and just things I collect in general, for the last 30-something years, I've had good archiving of those things. And so when a person, a topic, whatever shows up that has a sort of a keyword that allows me to search for it, I just have this thing I call a meta searcher, which is just a searcher that searches all the different places in my file system. I've also scanned the 250,000 or so pages of paper that I produced sort of before, mostly in the about mid-1980s, when I was still doing things on paper. I've scanned all of those and OCR'd them. And so if I have something that comes from that long ago, it's something that, again, gets pulled up in my meta searcher. That also pulls up, as I say, email, files, scanned documents, also pulls up things from our company records that contain information about those kinds of things. So that's my kind of way of dealing with that. As far as I would say articles, things like research papers and things like that, if there's a PDF of it, I'll stick it in the bucket, so to speak. If there isn't, okay, when it comes to just pure links, I tend to make notebooks, and in each bucket, I'll have a thing notes 01, notes 02, notes 03, etc. Sometimes I'll say notes -04- and then a topic name. So the thing keeps ordered by kind of the sequence in which I produce the notes. But then I know, again, when I go back to that bucket, I might have a notes 01 through notes 07 or something that were put there over the course of maybe 5 years at different times. And now when that project is active, I'm just going to read through all of them. And that's the time when I really want those sort of in my current working memory to think about them. So those are kinds of some approaches. I would say that things that just sort of in an unstructured way go into my personal human memory. I think I have a reasonably good memory, but it's always challenging. And honestly, even in terms of my own remembering of things, if I say I'm remembering this because it's connected to such and such a thing, it helps me. But I would say the number one thing is just putting things in these buckets for projects that I'm planning to do. And sometimes what will happen is there'll be a project I'm planning to do, sometimes for a decade, sometimes for 2 decades, whatever. It'll have a particular name. And then there's one project in particular, my symbolic discourse language project, which will undoubtedly change its name before it lands. But that's had about 4 different names. And so if you look at the file system for that, at the bucket for that, so to speak, you'll find it has subfolders that are for different names that's had in the past. Doesn't really matter. I'm hopefully soon going to make that project active. I'll just go through all of those things because that's easy to do at the time when I've, after the accumulation is a slow process. The actively starting to work on it, it's like, okay, I'm rolling up my sleeves, I'm going to work on this thing. I can perfectly well go through all these items to study that particular thing. So that's the approach I try to take. It's the important thing. The sort of general principle is sort of organize those things into things that will be related to sort of definite activities where you say, I'm going to do this now. There have been times when I've had things where I say, oh, this is a very useful general reference. I'm just going to put this somewhere because it's a useful general reference. It's usually a disaster when I do that. Unless it's something that I'm really going to look at every day, and there are very few of those things. Those things, okay, I should explain one more thing. I have a personal homepage that, of course, is built in Wolfram Language, but deploys into just HTML in our cloud. It contains links to things that I use all the time. Whenever there's something that I don't use all the time, I even forget it's on that page. And it probably has, a couple of hundred links on it, on that page. And I tend to, again, they're in sections, and sometimes there'll be, there might be some website where there's, let's say it's Wolfram Alpha. And then there'll be a vertical bar, and then it'll say the test version. Then it might have the dashboards for usage dashboards. Maybe it has the versions in different languages and things like that. They're all sort of in one line. So I kind of have it organized when I'm looking at it. But I find that even things which I'm not actively using very much, I tend to even forget they're there on my personal homepage. And I end up just searching for them in some completely different way. And typically what I'm doing is about every couple of times a year, I'm sort of looking at my personal homepage and saying, oh, there's a good bunch of goofy stuff here. I'm going to reorganize it. And it usually doesn't take me very long to remember the reorganization because I've got enough high traffic things on the page that I'll be noticing the organization. I also routinely, I would say, probably 2-3 times a month, will add something to that page. There are also things which so there's another tricky issue of organization, which I would say I have not done perfectly. Okay, I should explain a couple of other things. Okay, another piece of organization that I have is an events folder. And my events folder is organized by year, and it has a subfolder for every event I'm doing. Now, an event is some kind of usually one-off thing. It is a talk I'm giving. It might be our summer school. It might be something like this. And that then is a folder associated with that event. And it's a folder that will be sort of intensely active in connection with that event specifically, and then will just become archival. And in a given year, I maybe do, 30 events or something. I don't know, maybe a little more than that. It depends on how active the year is in terms of events. So I just have 30 subfolders, and they're all sitting there. And when there's a new event coming up, I'm just, I know the name of the event. It just has a subfolder. I just go there, and that's where, and everything related to that event. So let's say I'm going to give a talk or something, and I'm giving a title and an abstract for that talk. There'll be a notebook that has the title and abstract, and it'll be in that folder. And so when I'm actually sort of about to be active, I'm about to actually give that talk, I'll open that folder and say, oh, what did I say I was going to talk about here? It's right there in the folder. So that's another thing. But a thing that can happen is that there are things which, let's say we're doing our summer school, or we have our annual technology conference, or one of these other kinds of things, and there's a whole lot of material related to that. That will go in the events folder, and it will be active for a certain time. Sometimes I will put things related to that. I've tried to avoid doing this actually on my personal homepage, because I don't really want to change the personal homepage a lot. So I tend to have generic links, like to our summer school, which will go to pages that will then have redirections on them to the current year's material and so on when that becomes active. So let's see, is there anything else along those lines I could tell you guys? I think that's a good start for my sort of personal organization efforts. Let's see. So question here from Raphael about startups. He's asking specifically about Latin America, but he's asking about starting a company where there's no specific tech community, or the people might not be ready for the adoption of the thing you have. Right, well, so there are a couple of points to make here. So one question is, if you're going to do a company, let's say a software company, should you do it in a place where there are lots of other software companies, or should you do it in a place where there are no other software companies? I think that depends a little bit on the personality, on your personality, maybe more even than the mechanics of the company itself. Let me explain that issue. Let's say you say, I'm going to do a software company. Let's say I'm going to do a company that is related to, I don't know, video or something like this. That's a bad example. Let's just say, you could say, well, where's the place in the world that has more software engineers than any other? Highest density of software engineers. Pretty high density in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's nowadays a certain density in New York City. There's a certain density in a few other places. You can say, well, I want to go to a place where there's a high density of people who are relevant to the company I'm trying to do. Well, that's fine. That means you show up there and people will say, well, I could, if I'm going to do this particular thing, I've got 10 companies that I could go work for. Yours is one of them, and convince me to work for your company rather than a bunch of others. But nevertheless, there are those engineers or whatever it is right there available. They can sort of come and work at your company. You go to a place where people are like, there are no other software companies in town. It's like you could have a situation where people say, what's software? I don't know what that is. Nobody knows anything about it. Or you could have a situation where people say, fantastic, I've always wanted to work for a software company. There just wasn't one in town here. This is terrific. Now, of course, things have changed in the last couple of years, particularly about sort of how remotely you can have people working for a company. My company, we have been very geo-distributed for 25 years, more than that, maybe 30 years now. And so that's sort of a different dynamic. It's not, are you there in town doing something? Then really the question is, it's even a question, what does it even mean to be located in place X? You might be there as CEO, but maybe your employees are mostly distributed in completely different places. I have to say that my own impression, and perhaps this is as I say, it's a little bit of a personality type issue. There's sort of a choice. You can be doing a popular thing in a popular place and so on, in which case you're part of all kinds of other people who are doing that thing. And everybody knows what the point of what you're doing is. Other people say, oh yeah, I get it. But it's a very competitive situation where it's like, well, there are lots of other people in the same place doing the same kind of thing. That's sort of thing number one. Thing number two is you can be doing something that you care about, but nobody around you cares about. And as far as other people are concerned, it's like, oh, that person's doing that weird thing. We don't know about that. We don't care about it. It's a backwater kind of activity. It's you have to then different situation. In the first case I mentioned, as soon as you say, I'm doing X, people will say, oh, you're doing X. We understand what that is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Second case, you say, I'm doing X. People say, what on earth is that? Explain that to me. So in that second case, you're constantly having to tell people, this is what X is. It's great. Here's why. Let me explain it to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are two different choices. But on the other hand, in that second case, you can go decades with nobody else doing what you're doing. And where people are just like, oh, you're doing that? Okay, I'm doing something completely different. It isn't a competitive type thing. It's a thing where you get to just build what you build for yourself. It's not the same kind of story. So those are, depending on your personality, those are two different situations you might like to find yourself in. Personally, I tend to prefer the second one. I tend to prefer the one where I'm doing something that nobody else around necessarily cares about. I like to build a team where the team cares about it, but I'm not so concerned about whether sort of the ambient world cares about these things. I mean, perhaps my reason for that personally is that I'm sort of, I suppose it's an egotistically gratifying thing to feel that I'm doing something that wouldn't be being done unless I was doing it, rather than I'm going to do something a little bit better than other people, but everybody else knows I'm doing it, and I'm going to get an A star, or something if I do it well, because everybody kind of knows what it is. I prefer I'm doing something unique that in the next 100 years nobody would have done if I hadn't done it, rather than I'm going to sort of win the race relative to other people. But different people work differently, and different people get motivated in different ways. So in terms of now, when you're starting a company, there are things which, at least in the past, have been issues. Like people say, what does it mean to start a company? I don't even know how to incorporate a company in this place, wherever it is. I don't know, there might be a situation where people are, where you try to hire people and they're like, I don't know what it means to have a startup here. I don't think that's an issue in today's world. I think that sort of startup culture in the last probably 15 years has become sufficiently widely known that pretty much anywhere in the world, people will say, oh, you say, I'm going to do a tech startup. They'll say, oh, I know what a tech startup is. You don't really have to explain that. Back in the day, you did have to explain that. And I explained it many times in the past, but I don't think you have to explain that anymore. I think people kind of know what it is. Now, the question is things like, okay, if you need investment money, can you get investment money? A lot of, I think, certainly in the past, investment money was very local. People were like, I knew plenty of Silicon Valley venture capital people who said, I'll never invest in something that, takes me more than 30 minutes to drive to type thing. I want to actually see the people in person. I want to kind of be able to have a direct, personal interaction with everybody I'm investing in and so on. I don't know whether that's going to have survived the pandemic. I think that may not be a thing so much anymore. I'm not sure about that. May go the other way. People may say, I'm so desperate to interact with people in person. We really got to do this in person. When it comes to assessing whether something is going to be, if you're an investor and you're trying to figure out, is this company going to be a win or not? Does it help to meet the people in person? Probably does. Does it help to understand sort of the ambience of what's going on with the company and the people? It absolutely helps. It is a very difficult thing when you're presented with, here's a potential company idea, here are some people. It's like, is this going to be a win or not? Is this going to be a good thing to invest in or not? It's really hard to tell. I think, I have friends who I think will be viewed as some of the sort of top venture capital people, and I think they would say it's very hard to tell. They typically will say they, have found it better to bet on the people than the ideas, typically. That is, there will be a person who can turn any idea, even an idea that seemed kind of goofy at the beginning, and they'll find a way to navigate that idea through to success. While somebody who has a fantastic idea, if you have sort of the wrong person, will navigate it to failure, so to speak. And so people tend to say, I'm going to bet on the person more than the idea, but it's more complicated than that, because it's, there's a person who can be presenting, it's sort of, the person is mostly, in most cases, is coming with the idea. That's what they're presenting. It's like, I'm me, and I'm going to CEO this company, and this is my idea, and you're presenting the two things together. If it's just like, I'm me, let me tell you why I'm great, independent of any idea. It's kind of like these SPAC companies, these special purpose acquisition company ideas, where it's like people invest a bunch of money and then they're going to go find something to invest in. I suppose one could imagine sort of a SPAC version of raising money as a CEO, where you say, just invest money in me, and I'm going to find something interesting to use that money for. That hasn't yet. Now that I think about it, maybe it's a thing that should be happening. It hasn't really yet been a thing. It's always like people raise money as a CEO. They say, give me money to do this particular thing. So, I think there's a question if you're trying to do that in a place where there really isn't a tradition of, for example, investment, or the investment tradition is different. Is that a problem? Probably is a problem if you're trying to raise money. It may not be so much of a problem in this post-pandemic world, so to speak, because it may be that investment has also become as geo-distributed as I think some work will become. I have to say, I suspect, as I say, our company has been very geo-distributed for 30 years, and we've developed a culture where that works just great. I think a lot of companies don't have that culture, and even though they've been sort of using it for a year and a half, it isn't very natural to them. And my guess is that there will be quite a bit of backlash of like people saying, oh yes, everybody can work remotely. Well, actually this isn't working very well. No, you've all got to come back to the office. I think there will be cases where people say, oh, look, remote work really worked. We can, have this really be done remotely. But I'm going to guess that more companies than one would expect will realize that their long-term corporate culture was not as compatible with this, and that they could do it in a pinch, but that it wasn't really the way that was natural for them to be doing it. I think, so I don't really know how that's going to work in terms of investment money and so on. I think that, it has been typically the case that there are parts of the world, like Silicon Valley, for example, where a given idea, if you say, how much is it worth? How much can you get invested in this idea? There'll be some number in Silicon Valley. There'll be some smaller number in, I don't know, someplace in Europe. There'll be some even smaller number somewhere else, just because the expectations of scale are different. Now, another question is customers. Depends what you're making. There are some things that are pretty regional and where you have to actually meet your customers to be able to sell it. Maybe you have to deliver the object to customers to be able to sell it. Then obviously it matters where you are in the world, so to speak. If what you're doing is, I'm going to put up a website, it's like you could be anywhere. You could be, for all anybody knows, it's a dolphin, a chimpanzee or something putting up that website. Nobody will necessarily know. I always find it interesting when I see a website, I ask myself the question, where did this website come from? Where, is it a sort of plain American website, or did it get created in some other country, or is it something that's based in Scandinavia or Romania or I don't know, some other place in the world? Can you tell? And sometimes you go and you notice a few funny things about the website. You notice some particular type of sort of style presentation that seems, reminds you of kind of French culture or something. And then you realize, you look in the end and you find, oh yes, it's a French company or whatever. And it does tend to be the case that even though, that companies that sort of come from a particular part of the world, often their presentation will reflect the part of the world they come from. That may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. It really depends on lots of things, but it's something where if you are in place X, there is some sense in which kind of the local culture is going to rub off on you, and that will be visible in the way that you present what you're doing. And I think that comes through, when you try and market products. I mean, for example, one thing that has often been the case is you see companies, I would see them quite often from, well, particularly Europe, for example, where it's like just the kind of the worldview about the product was strangely different than it would be in the US. And the things that people thought were important about the product and thought were important to say about the product were different from what they were in the US. And that meant that when those places would try and, they could market well within their country, where they understood what they were marketing and who they were marketing it to. But when they tried to sort of make the jump to the US market, for example, it just didn't quite ring correctly. And it wasn't successful there. I mean, I think that, you see this in advertising in general, and I, don't know the ads of very many countries, but, traditionally there will be, I don't know, in the UK, for example, where I have to say I'm probably deeply out of date, but it used to be the case that ads were much more intellectual, and they maybe barely mentioned the product they were advertising, whereas in some other countries it'd be like, the product, it's there in every frame. And it's, and there are statements like, the product is great, where, if you saw that in a UK ad or something, that would be just deadly. People would just laugh at it. Maybe there's some retro, kind of sort of second level kind of version of it where it'd be okay. But as such, you wouldn't do that. It's a very sort of indirect way of communicating things. And I suppose that ambient culture that you see in ads in different countries does tend to come through when people are trying to present their own company, perhaps for a global market. And I would say that I'm quite sure that when we try to present things in other markets, it's a challenge. It's, we end up with people, let's say in Japan, India, or I don't know, wherever else, we try to make sure we have specific people who really understand something about that market and that culture, because the things that you might say, I mean, I don't know, for example, in Wolfram Alpha in Japan, we have a version in Japanese, and, a big break there was some, having nothing to do with us, some teen pop star type person who, put on, I don't know where, Line or some other place like that, some social media place, that this was really helping her with her homework. Okay, great. Would that have worked in the US? Would a comparable thing, could we have taken that idea and made that a US idea? Probably not. Probably wouldn't have worked. It's probably the set of people who the type of communication that that was relevant there was very different. That was a particular thing that just sort of, we were like, oh, thanks, we appreciate the the shout out type thing. It wasn't something that we had orchestrated. In other places, it's like, you have to really think through how are you going to present things. And I think it's the same coming out from a country, so to speak, and saying, how do you present to the world? You're used to a particular form of presentation in that country that may ring very poorly in another part of the world. I think this happens with, our company, we're probably fortunate because we do have people from all over the world involved with the company. And I think that provides us a certain level of perspective that I find really useful in terms of understanding kind of sort of different views of things that you might get from around the world. Let's see. There's all kinds of questions here. Okay, there's a question from Milan. How do you manage family life around a busy schedule with personal and business interests? I have 4 kids. 3 are pretty grown up by now. And I enjoy them very much. And I've tended to, the typical thing I do is I work really hard, and I probably work, I don't know how many, 14 hours a day, I don't know, 16 hours a day. I have no idea what it is, probably 14 or something. But I've tended for years, like for 25 years or more, at about 6 o'clock local time, I'm going to go off and have dinner, and with whatever family members are around, and I'll restart my kind of work. I often say I'm really going to restart by 8 o'clock, but it's always 8:30 in practice. Now, will I be completely 100% focused on non-work things for that period? No, I'll have my computer, and as soon as I get bored, I'll open it up and be doing things. But fundamentally, that's a time that I've sort of tended to carve out for that purpose. I have found I've had all kinds of different mechanisms and venues in which I've been able to, interact with my wife and various and children and so on. And I think it's I tend to find, I think predictability tends to be a good thing all around, and of particular times when people expect that this is going to happen, that's going to happen, etc., rather than just like, oh, let's kind of play by ear what we're going to do. I found that doesn't work very well, because people, it's sort of, it's a question of, oh, well, the time when you think you're going to do this, actually the other person isn't really ready, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I found that is a good mechanism. I would say another thing, particularly for my children, is they're not unaware of what I do for a living, so to speak. And there are all kinds of things where things I do are things that I'm talking to them about, maybe they help with, maybe they're users of things we do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not kind of a separated thing where it's like, oh, there's me going off and doing sort of black box work, and there's me being kind of a person interacting with family and so on. It's a somewhat more mixed thing, and I think that's been, I'm sure that's been interesting. My different children have different approaches and attitudes towards what we've been doing and which parts of it they're interested in. But I would say that it's, for them, I would like to think it's been a big positive to, for example, see so many projects go from sort of from just getting started or just being thought about to being sort of big things in the world. Often my children have given me a hard time about some new project that I'm doing, about like, that's a stupid project and so on. And sometimes they're right, and quite often they're not right. And I think that's probably been a useful thing to be seen all around. I would say that, yeah, that's, let's see. Okay, there's a question here from your chill mate. It says, how can you deal with school that demotivates your will to explore and learn new stuff? Yeah, well, just do stuff on your own. I think one of the terrible things about schools often these days is they become kind of all-encompassing 24/7 activities. I don't think it was true in the distant past. I think school was school, and then there was the rest of your life. And for me, for example, when I was a kid, I went to very fine schools that were kind of very, would generate lots of work and so on, but somehow didn't take even close to all my time. And so I spent most of my time doing things I was interested in, which in those days was typically physics. And, I would do big projects and so on. And in many cases, somewhat pathologically, perhaps in retrospect, I would write big things. I didn't show them to anybody for 30 years. That, you can now find them on the web. But, I was just doing them for myself because I thought they were interesting, and wasn't sort of for worldly consumption, so to speak. But I think the important thing is make sure you have time to do stuff you are interested in. If 100% of your time is being spent just doing, treadmill, stuff that you say, oh, I should be doing this because then I'm going to get a certificate that will let me do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, I kind of think that's a mistake. I know there are people who really enjoy the kind of the racetrack atmosphere, so to speak, of I'm just going to do more stuff and I'm going to run faster than everybody else. I don't happen to be one of those people. Some people are, and I think for some people it's very motivating to be in that situation. But by the time you're asking about things, about being demotivated from things in school, I would say the thing to do is figure out what you are motivated about, have that be a thing that you can spend time on, and carve out the time to spend time on that. And even if somebody says to you, oh, if you're in high school, let's say, oh, if you don't do at least 5 extracurricular activities, colleges aren't going to like you. It's like, okay, so what? In other words, if there's a college that says you need to have done 5 maybe too many, but extracurricular activities, well, that college is being goofy, doesn't make any sense. Maybe that college isn't the right college. Maybe it's a college which has, is past its prime and asking for things that don't make any sense. I think that the thing that one might want to, so I would say the important thing is find things you care about and then spend some amount of your time at least doing those things. When it comes to things in school, it's, one of the things that can happen is there are classes which maybe if you can choose what classes you take, for goodness sake, choose classes that you actually care about. If you do a class you don't care about, yeah, you might do okay. You'll get whatever grade you get. And then a year will go by and somebody will ask you about it. And it's like, oh yeah, I did a class about that. I don't remember anything in that class. That's like, you just wasted the time really, unless the only goal was to get the piece of paper to get, to move up the next rung of the ladder. But that's an unfortunate way to live. Much better that you do a class where you say, well, I'm really curious about this class. I'm really interested. It's going to be really fun. You get really excited about it. You put time into it. The time kind of whizzes by, and then you remember it for the rest of your life. Now, I might say about this thing about, oh, you've got to check this box, do this extracurricular, do this thing, do that thing, because then people will like you better. Well, there's often theories about that. And there's often things where people say, well, you've got to have done this and this and this, and then you'll be positioned to do whatever. Often those theories are nonsense. And often those theories are about the past. It's like, well, it was the case that this was the way, based on the analysis of Ivy League schools at this time, this is exactly the right box to check to get into this. And, doing exactly the right kind of sort of socially conscious, whatever thing was the exact right thing box to check. Oh, but whoops, the world moved on. And there's a new class of people who are, getting to the top schools because they had this great, video blog, or because they had this great other thing, or because, in other words, I have to say I'm a great believer in just do what motivates you yourself. And then so long as you can present what you're doing and you say to some school or some employer, this is the great stuff I'm doing, do you like it? And if they say no, well, then it's probably not a good fit. If every place in the world says no, then that's more of a challenge. And then you end up being an entrepreneur and having to sort of stand the organization up for yourself, so to speak, rather than saying, I'm going to join your school, company, whatever, where I can get to do this and you're going to want me to do it, so to speak. So I think, it's do the things you want to do and then figure out. And sometimes it's a puzzle. Like you say, I've got to do these things because that's what I need to do to get to this school, company, whatever else, that's exactly my dream, whatever it is, right? And you've got a whole theory of how to get there. I would say that type of theory is one of those calculated for failure kinds of things. In other words, sometimes you'll be wrong about that was the exact right path to follow, checking all the boxes, you get perfect scores and everything, and then you discover, well, actually the colleges that you want to go to say, well, if the person is that perfect, there must be something, they're too one-dimensional, they're not what we want type thing, or who knows what. That's one thing. The other thing is sometimes the thing you thought was your dream place, you were wrong about it. Sometimes you get there and then it's like, be careful what you wished for because it isn't what you thought it was. And, sometimes it's actually a good thing when you say, here's what I am, here's what I do, here's what I like to do. So long as you can present that well, and the place you're presenting it to says, we don't like that. Well, maybe that's a sign that had you gone there, you would in fact not have been happy because in fact it wasn't a good fit. Not to say that it's a perfect system. It is far from a perfect system. And there are many constraints and issues and crazy things and confusions and so on that happen. So that's not a perfect process, but it's something to realize that it may not be completely flawed in those respects. But I would say that the, this idea of, so then another issue is that people around you are saying, you should do this and this and this. Well, they might be right. They might be 30 years out of date. It might be like, well, when I was in college, says a parent like me or something, when I was in college, this is how it worked. That must be how it works today. Oh, well, actually, it doesn't work that way. So, there are all kinds of issues like that that come up. Let's see. I think that this question was about, school demotivating things. I mean, there's some other things that can happen. Like, for example, it's like, well, I think I'm going to do math in school, but everybody says I'm bad at math when I do math in school. That happened to me when I was 10 years old, actually. Actually, I wasn't so keen on math, but I didn't do very well in math when I was about 10 years old. And turns out at the time, math consisted of sort of doing algebra and getting all the minus signs right and so on. And I found it kind of boring and I couldn't really see the point of it. I sort of soon did see the point of it in terms of wanting to do things like physics that use that stuff. And then I had this kind of idea, well, maybe I can get a computer to do that stuff instead. So then sometimes there are these kind of silver linings that happen about this thing where it's like, let's say some subject that you're doing and you're not doing very well in it in school. That could be because it's just not a very good fit for you, but it could also be that the subject as you learn it at that stage in school isn't the real thing that's the interesting version of that subject. I know, for example, English writing, very common case for this. People who are going to become great writers often don't do very well in earlier stages of school because somebody says, does your essay fit this particular template for how essays should be structured? It doesn't. You're going to get a bad grade. Is it a brilliant essay? Yes, it's a brilliant essay, but the person can't necessarily tell that. And it may not be, they say, but I'm grading everybody's essay the same way, so I've got to grade your essay poorly, even though, well, yes, if it appeared in some place where there were great essays, somebody would say, wow, that really pulls me in, it's really a great essay. But it just doesn't fit that particular template and pattern. And so that can happen. And sometimes the stage of a subject that you're learning in school isn't the interesting stage of the subject. Sometimes you need what you consider to be the boring stage of the subject to be able to sort of build the scaffolding to get to the next stage. I would say that's rarer than you think. I would say that usually if you're motivated in a subject, you can learn the more advanced stuff that you're more interested in. You can gradually fill in the more elementary stuff later, even though according to the sort of official school way of doing it, it's like, don't run before you can walk. I found it's the story of a lot of stuff I've learned is, I learn the advanced stuff that I care about. And then I realize, oh my gosh, there's some elementary thing I don't understand. Okay, then you go off and understand it. And so long as it doesn't freak you out that like, oh my gosh, I've been building this kind of giant castle in the sky, so to speak, and there's a big support pillar that's missing. Well, then you go fill it in. I mean, like I'm about to do a sort of binge reading of a bunch of things to do with, let's see, several different areas actually, about philosophy and about math and various other kinds of things, where it's like, yeah, there are things I don't know, and that I need to know now. I didn't ever care about them before. If I'd done a class about them back in the day, I didn't do that many classes at all myself, but if I'd done a class, I probably would have been, I probably just wouldn't have got the point, just no idea. Actually, I'm thinking of it, there's a particular kind of sort of computational structure that I've just been looking at, where for years I've heard about these things. I've never understood them. Every time I look at them, it's like, I'm totally confused by this. I finally have a reason to care about these things, and I now understand, I think, how they work rather nicely, and I have my own understanding of it, and I'm all excited about it. But that's something on that. Let's see. There's a question here. Gosh, there's lots of interesting questions here. From Idiod. How much time do you spend on technology intelligence? How are you keeping eyes on topics you may be interested in? I kind of read all kinds of just general magazines and stuff and so on. I also, the things that I'm interested in sort of today, they often have little spin-offs that relate to other things that are going on, and I'll poke those a little bit. I tend to be one of these people who, when there's a new technology coming out, I'll always try and, I'll buy the gadget. I'll, get the software installed. I'll, if it's relevant, I'll talk to the company that's making it or whatever. I'll ask somebody in my company to go research it a bit. I like to be I like to know something about the leading edge. Sometimes that's confusing because sometimes the leading edge is 20 years too early, and you learn about the thing and then you say, it's all nonsense. And then you keep saying that even when many years later it isn't nonsense. And I have to say, one of the things I made a mistake once, and I sort of decided I'd never make this mistake again, which was when the web started. It took me a number of months to really start caring about the web. Why? Well, because there'd been previous things. There'd been Gopher, there'd been Wace, there'd been a bunch of things you've never heard of, which were like ways to access sort of server-based things. And, I knew about all of them. I'd learned about all of them, and they were all kind of, whatever. Then, what really launched the web was things like being able to have GIFs on the web and a sort of being able to have graphical content and so on. And I didn't particularly, it took me a few months to realize, this is something significant, and it's really different from what I'd previously seen with something that I thought was the same kind of technology. So I try to not make that mistake again. But sometimes if you learn about stuff too early, it either, it's hard to see why one would care. And, another good example is machine learning. I knew about neural nets back in 1980. I even worked on neural nets back then. I didn't know why one would care. Because I couldn't get them to do anything interesting. I knew there were people who were working on this, there were people who kind of pursued it for a long time. And every time I'd look at what they were doing, it's like, this is kind of complicated engineering stuff, and it's not clear it works very well. And maybe it has a few use cases, but it's not a general thing. And so then when I first, in 2011, when people kind of suddenly discovered that, actually, you can use these deep networks and do image recognition, and it actually works. It took me probably a few extra months to be like, this is something interesting that we should really look at, because I had already had that past knowledge. Now, perhaps it cuts both ways, because the fact that I already knew well about how neural nets worked, I knew a bunch of the people involved in it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that probably tipped the balance the other way of helping me to understand new technology better. But it's a complicated thing. And I think, one of the things I've also found is that internalizing technology, using it oneself, is really important. There are things where it's like, yes, I hear about, there's this amazing thing that you can do, and it's all a bit abstract to me. I mean, I was really struck maybe more than a decade ago now, when I finally, I was pretty early in that business, said, okay, I'm going to get my genome sequenced. Right? And the thing comes back in a little disk drive and all that. I think I was maybe 30th, I don't know what, something or other, not some number of tens of first people, so to speak, to get their whole genome sequenced. We were working with a company that did that sequencing at the time and so on. So it was kind of a bit of an inside story. But the thing that did for me was, once I had my genome on my computer, all those things that I'd sort of theoretically learned about genetics, within a day, I really understood those a lot better, because I could kind of, I don't know, maybe it gave me more of a reason to care. Maybe it was just a concrete example where it's like, I'm just going to really look at this, in a concrete case, what about my gene for whatever it is? You know, how does it compare to the reference sequence? Let me understand that. Oh, what does it mean that it has this, you know, stack of reads and a consensus from the stack of reads and so on? Oh, there's a place where I really care about that base pair, but it doesn't have a consensus value. Then I'm sort of into it and really trying to understand what's going on. And so for me, when I sort of see some piece of technology just purely float by, it's much less helpful to me than when I can actually internalize it. Now, sometimes that internalization for me as somebody running a software company is, oh, let me get the team to go investigate this, and then they'll make some kind of proof of concept version of here's how we connect to such and such a thing or make use of such and such a thing. And then it's like, okay, now I can concretely understand it within this context that I understand of our software stack. Let's see. JY says, I started a business by accident, and now I'm trying to find out how to build a real business around what was started by accident. Well, that sounds like a fortunate situation. If you've started it by accident and somehow it just took off of its own accord. You know, one of the things that can be challenging, it's been challenging sometimes for me, is there's a business that you say, I don't know, we might as well give this a try, but it's not very interesting. And then the world loves it. And it's like people are like, oh yeah, this is great. And then sometimes you're thinking, well, actually, I don't really care about this. That wasn't what I was really trying to build. That's sort of a sideshow to what I was trying to build. I think you have to then get motivated to realize that the actual process of building the business is interesting in its own right. And it's kind of you know, you have to really focus on that. Even though what you thought you were doing was building, let's say, a piece of technology or something of this kind, it's like so where do you engage the thinking apparatus? You can engage the thinking apparatus in thinking about the technology itself, and you could say, oh, but the business is sort of easy or irrelevant or not what I was really looking for. Or you can say, let me turn my sort of thinking attention to the actual building of the business itself. Just like I design software, let's say, let me design the business and let me try and think through how, what are the processes that I need to have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes with businesses that sort of start to take off, there's a question of, so who do you bring in to help with it? Do you wheel in the professionals and say, okay, now it's up to you to deal with this? My own inclination is that that's not a very good idea. That when there are particular functions, let's say you need a CFO, you need you need somebody to maintain, a server infrastructure, you need, these particular functions, then absolutely you should bring in people who can do those functions. It will work better if you have some understanding, if you could do some version of that function yourself, and then you hire somebody to do it, and maybe they do it a bit better than you could do it, but you vaguely, you do more or less understand what they're doing. It's not just a black box where you say, now you do the magic marketing thing. Even though I don't understand anything about marketing, that's not going to work well. You have to understand roughly what people are going to be doing. And then you can say, now I understand what you're doing. I'm going to, you're a person who's going to be able to do this well and better than I can. Great, go do this. I think the idea where you say, I'm going to now turn this into a real business, let me wheel in the real business people and have them turn it into a real business, I think that's typically a doomed idea. I think that's an idea where you are, where it's kind of like you have the vision for what you're trying to do. And so you have a great advantage over anybody else who comes in, even if you have somebody who is much more experienced at the general process of starting businesses. The vision, the understanding of the vision is an important thing. It is a very challenging thing to take an idea and sort of wheel in a CEO for it. Actually, there's a thing in the NFT space where I'm trying to do that right now. So if anybody out there thinks they are a great, somewhat consumer-oriented sort of CEO who can take technology and kind of help deploy it, we're looking for such a thing right now. But that is, I have to say, I think that's a difficult thing to find. And I suspect we'll end up betting on somebody who hasn't done CEOing before and who, for whatever reason, we think is well positioned to really take this on, or maybe has done some very small scale CEOing or something. I would say that the other thing about kind of wheel in the professionals, so to speak, is, building companies is hard, and you have to be pretty motivated to do it. And when somebody says, I'm just going to come in and I'm going to, punch in at 9 o'clock, punch out at 5 o'clock, and I'm going to build the company. I don't know. That's extremely challenging to make work. Maybe it's worked. I've not seen it work. It tends to be the case that, you really have to be eating, breathing, loving the thing you're doing in order to build it with the energy that it needs to actually build it. And I think that it's like, oh shucks, I built a company by mistake. When you're really in the big building phase, it's just not. It's the oh shucks, I ended up discovering a product or discovering a way to get a company started. That can happen sort of oh shucks by mistake. But once you're in the actual building process and the actual running of the company, it tends to be a serious consuming thing, not for everybody. I mean, a thing that for me, I've been CEOing my current company for 35 years or something now. And, I don't think I've really had a true vacation day all that time. It's like things will come up. And although the company is, not a small company at this point, it's got many layers of management. It's got, most individual, oh, something blew up today. I'm not the one who's going to be handling that. But it's still the case that somehow it just turns out you don't get to have a vacation if you're doing serious CEOing. And perhaps it also is affected in my case by the fact that we're always doing new stuff. And that's a place where it's very hard to, I tend to have to provide the leadership to get new stuff done, even if it isn't my idea, even if it's an idea that came from somewhere else. To get the ship to turn in that direction tends to require some kind of central leadership. Let's see. Question here from Ori that I'm not sure I completely understand, but I'll try and it's a question: how important is law for success and payoff, and what are doors it opens? Given that Bill Gates has a higher net worth than Steve Jobs had, I'm not sure I even know that. I don't think that will be the case anymore. I bet I bet that Steve's stake of Apple would have to be pretty valuable right now, and maybe Lorene now controls that. I don't really know. I haven't followed all of those things, but the question, I suppose, is sort of the using the law as a tool for company success and so on. I mean, it relates to the question of kind of you are setting things up and you have a contract and you very cleverly manage to put this little extra clause in the contract that has clause to the clause, so to speak. And there's going to be, some terrible hook that the other side is going to realize little ways into it. Oh my gosh, they managed to get that into the contract. We're toast type thing. That's a terrible way to do business. I mean, contracts should be an explanation of what people, of sort of a way of describing the alignment of companies, for example, that perhaps can survive. Oh, the team changed, nobody knows what was agreed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and gives a framework for working together. But by the time you're relying on some little hook somewhere to extract something, and it wasn't sort of part of the sort of the whole alignment of what was being done, I think it's an unfortunate way to be doing business. Now, occasionally you'll end up in situations where the other side are schmucks, and then you're like, well, I'm very glad that we made sure that there was this this clause in there that says if this terrible thing happens, then that thing happens, and so on. But I would say that that's not that would not be, at least in my theory of business, that's not kind of what one's looking for. One's looking for, that's just a way of representing kind of what everybody had understood and taking it forward, so to speak. And I think there are places where, people have used at different times, even friends of mine have done this quite a bit, used patent law as kind of a way to say, it was my idea, or sometimes not even it was my idea, it was I bought this patent as an investment and now I'm going to use it to make money, so to speak. I'm not a fan of that way of living. It's this thing about, it was my idea, give me something for it. If that really worked perfectly, I would be, that would be great for my success, so to speak, because I've had a lot of ideas in my life and they've turned out often to be quite good. And it's, have I got my due for all of those ideas? Absolutely not. Is that, do I think that, had I been more sort of meticulous legally, would I have got my due? Oh, I doubt it, but maybe I would have spent, decades of my life litigating with people saying, give me my due for this thing. Personally, I would much prefer to be in a position of inventing more stuff and trying to do things with the things I've invented, rather than saying, oh, I've got this hook, let me make use of that hook. I mean, frankly, it's well, if you're involved in kind of academic intellectual things, it is shocking the extent to which sort of bad behavior occurs there. In the business world, I would say bad behavior occurs less often, and certainly the kind of the overarching structure of law helps bad behavior happen less often. It is a better defined area, I would say, than sort of intellectual academic kinds of things, because it's something where there's been, where there's an actual structure in the legal system, as opposed to just, oh, well, the convention is blah, 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 and but people don't necessarily follow it. There's probably more to say about that, but I'm not sure. Okay, there's a question from Comp Bio. Who are people under 30 that inspire me? That one is sort of easy. My children is a really good start. And, I've had the good fortune to work with a bunch of younger people, very bright young people who come through our summer school, summer camp, work at our company and so on. I really enjoy the young, so to speak. I also do a bunch of stuff with kids. What I particularly enjoy there is when people are kind of learning about the world and about ideas for the first time, they don't have all of this baggage of, oh, I know how it works. It has to work this way. I've heard about it for ages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're kind of free to ask questions and think about things in a kind of unfettered way. And, I think I try to channel that in the things I think about and try to think, what if the thing I've thought for the last 40 years isn't true, and actually this other thing is true? Let me see what that consequence that would have. And that's a very childlike kind of thing. That's a very young person kind of thing to do. And I like to believe that even at my ancient age, I'm still able to sort of think flexibly like that. But it's something that I definitely like seeing in young people, and I find sort of it's inspiring to see people where it's just like they come into things and sort of for the first time are looking at things. One of the things that happens is that I think people have a certain way of thinking about things, and that way of thinking about things, who knows how it's set, but they by the time they're high school age, they'll have that way of thinking about things. Sometimes, quite often, they'll have a definite way of thinking about things. Perhaps it's an unusual way of thinking about things, and if they find the right place to apply it, they'll be able to do all kinds of interesting things. Sometimes that unusual way of thinking about things, that's the one they got, and for the rest of their life, that's the one they're going to be pursuing. And if they're lucky, they'll find all kinds of venues in which that way of thinking really works out. But I think it's very interesting to see young people who have unusual ways of thinking that perhaps can crack things which the usual ways of thinking have not been able to crack. Sometimes somebody will have sort of an unusual way of thinking about things, and it's actually pretty rare that people get another completely different, unusual way of thinking about things later. It tends to be the case that, the unusual way of thinking about things or doing things that you get early is in some evolved form the thing you'll always have. I mean, I like to think that in my own case, there are things which I realized I was reasonably good at doing when I was quite young, and there are very much embellished versions of those things that I have made use of subsequently in my life. And whether it's and things where the core might be the same, like, I don't know, understanding things in a clear way or something, which turns into doing language design, which turns into doing various kinds of basic science, but the ultimate core skill is the same, but the embellishments look very, very fancy relative to that core skill. And so it isn't just, I have this particular thing I can do, and that's all I'll ever get to do. You can take that sort of core skill and embellish it, but to say, actually, I'm going to jump to a completely different core skill, that I think is a more challenging thing to do. Let's see. There's a question from Itza. How do you deal with the feeling that you need to understand everything that exists before you can do something original? That's a terrible trap if you get into that. I was looking at things actually about some areas of physics and math and so on that relate to the physics project we've just been doing. And it's like, oh my gosh, thank goodness I didn't read all this stuff, because I would have drowned in it. It's 100,000 papers about all kinds of things and all kinds of details and all kinds of ways of thinking about things. Turns out there's a kind of a way to cut through a lot of that. And the fact that I had some sort of awareness of these things, but I didn't dive into every detail, allowed me to make progress that I would never have been able to make if I'd been drowning in all of these details and all of these things where everybody knows X is true. Turns out X isn't true. But if you read 100 papers that say X is true, you are pretty much led to, well, X must be true, rather than, well, let me think about something different, and then maybe I can read these papers later and see how they reflect on what I now think is the case. I think what I tend to do is I define the problem very clearly of what I'm trying to work on, and I stick to that. And then I say, what do I need to understand to make progress with this problem? And it won't be everything. It won't be all these different directions and areas and things that are sort of relevant to a different problem. I'm just trying to drill my little tunnel through the field and say, I want to understand the answer to my particular problem. And then I will try and learn all of the sort of legs that are needed to reach my particular problem, but I won't try to just learn the whole field. Because again, it sort of relates to some things I was saying earlier. Learning things in an unmotivated way, I find very difficult. I think people generally find it more difficult, if maybe not as difficult as I find it. But when I'm motivated, when it's like, I need to know this, I learn it, I understand it, I remember it. If I'm just like, I'm going to abstractly learn this, I'm just really bad at that. And I know it, okay, great. I mean, sometimes at the level of learning small scale things, particularly when I'm talking to people, it's like they'll tell me something that's like, oh, I'm doing this work on this thing. And it's like, oh, that's cool. And I remember that particular thing, sometimes connected to the person, because I kind of, I'm interested in people and I kind of remember this is a person and here's how they were working on this. And that's how I remember it. But the disembodied fact I find hard to remember. But I would say it tends to be a trap to learn sort of everything that's been done. Now having said that, I'm a great believer in kind of doing one's homework. Once one has the particular thing one's doing, try and actually understand all the legs that connect to it. And also, for me, I find it very useful to go back and try and understand the history. And usually I like to understand the history after I have some understanding of where I think things are going. Then it's like, well, how did we get to where we got to now? Sometimes I also find it useful to understand the history just purely to contextualize what's going on. Like, for example, I was just looking a little bit, because I think some of the things I've been doing in basic science relate to immunology, and particularly theoretical immunology. And I was like, well, I knew something about that in the 1980s, and I knew some people involved in it. And it's like, let me go check in on what's happened to it. Turns out those people are still kind of, that field hasn't become a very big field, and those people seem to still be important people in that field. And for me to know that history and sort of the flow of, oh, it came from physics mostly, that's very useful to know. It helps me sort of contextualize what's going on and say, why isn't there more stuff in the theoretical side from biologists? Well, because it all came from physicists and so on. And knowing that history is very helpful in understanding kind of what's likely to be out there. And one of the things that can happen is you study a field and you think you more or less have it, and then there's some pocket somewhere that you didn't learn about. And I would say it's rather rare that that pocket ends up being something I really care about. It can happen. It can happen. Sometimes it's like somebody wrote a very visionary thing at some point and just everybody ignored it. And one finds it and it's like, well, what we know now, this is really terrific. And, I like to write things about history and to kind of recognize those contributions when one finds them. But that's something where it's not part of, the most common case for that. It's not part of kind of the mainstream, oh, this is basically how things get understood. Let's see, there's a question here from Alistair. What do you do when you suffer credibility due to lack of paper credentials? Have I had positive experiences with hiring people with skills but not credentials? Oh, heck yes. I mean, at one point, I haven't done this study recently, but at one point, this is a number of years ago, our advanced R&D group had, there was a time when I think we had more people who had dropped out of college than had got PhDs in that group. I don't think that's true anymore, but that was true for a while. It's a complicated thing. Credentials are complicated, and the mere existence of a credential, I think, is often quite irrelevant. Sometimes credentials also explain kind of in what ambient setting somebody was for X number of years. Oh, they're in a place where everybody was very ambitious, they'll probably be ambitious too. Or, oh, they're in a place where everybody was achieving lots of stuff, etc. Where some expectations were set in some way. I think let's take it for like PhDs, for example. If you're interested in your PhD and you're doing something interesting, and that's great. But, in terms of, you have to realize that as soon as somebody has a PhD, it is in a sense a narrowing credential. You might think of it as being an elevating credential, but for some purposes, depending on what you're looking for, it's a narrowing credential. Somebody studied this particular thing for 5 years. Now, it can be helpful to just study something for 5 years and get the experience of digging into something that deeply and so on and getting a definite result. And that's useful. But they studied this, in that way, that can be very useful, by the way, that take it far enough that you really can write your PhD thesis about it and so on. That's a very useful skill. But this idea of, oh, they got this, they got this kind of narrowing credential about this particular thing, depending on whether, unless you want to like hire somebody for that incredibly specific purpose, it's not going to do you much good. And in fact, it can be the case that people are much more narrowly knowledgeable if they went through and went through that tunnel of getting that credential than not. I would say that for me, the things that it's a tricky thing, hiring the right people. And, if you say, who are the best people? Well, it depends on what you're looking for. And it depends on what kind of organization you have. I think in our organization, I like to think we can get lots of kinds of people to thrive who would flounder horribly in most other kinds of organizations. We have a fairly unique organization. And there are other people where you plug them into some existing big company, they do great. You put them in our company and they'll be like, oh my gosh, everything is different. Everything is, there's innovation happening all over the place. This is totally disorienting. So, it really depends on, for a given person, and perhaps even at a given stage of life, there will be different environments that are good versus bad. But I think that the thing, my experience, when I see a cover letter for some job application that says, I am applying for your job X, I am qualified because I have this credential. it's like, well, for our company, I mean, we're not hiring, nurses or something like that. We're not hiring people with those kinds of specific professional certifications. But, at least for most roles. But in fact, I'm trying to think, there are just a few roles where I can imagine where professional certifications are directly relevant, but mostly not. It's more like, I think I can do this job because X, Y, Z, rather than I got this piece of paper, it proves I can do this. I must say that very early in the history of our company, I had some terrible experiences with people who had just magnificent paper credentials and were absolutely useless at doing the kinds of things we needed them to do. And on the flip side, I've had fantastic experiences with people who have, pathetic paper credentials, but they're able to do spectacular things. Sometimes you can tell that because they already did spectacular things. Sometimes you don't know necessarily what you're going to get, and very quickly you realize they're going to do spectacular things. And I think that's now, the process of hiring people, when you don't say, check this box, you've got this credential, you've got that credential, it's challenging. And I like to think that our HR department, for example, has been enculturated enough at our company that they're able to recognize things. And sometimes these things will wind up on my desk of like, what are we going to do with this? Is this, and it's like, you read through the stuff and it's like, wow, this person's really interesting, or, not for us. And I think it's not, I would say it's more what people have done and how they present that, and how they present to some extent themselves, but I would say it's more present the things they've done. That's the kind of thing that, for me at least, is resonates, or even what they're interested in, what they know about. Those are things that are useful. And again, different companies are different. We're a very direct, sort of low nonsense company, where saying something directly, even if it isn't as well polished and wonderful sounding, is much better than kind of fluffing it up and covering something which is kind of lousy. I think so. Anyway, that's I would say that but it really depends. I mean, there are plenty of companies where they're interviewing hundreds of thousands of people every year, and where the HR department has no choice but to say checkbox, checkbox, checkbox. There's just nothing else they can do. Or maybe sometimes they'll have their own tests and things that they'll run. But I think that it really varies. I mean, when you're dealing with a smaller company, there's a better chance that there's sort of more personal attention to these things. When you're dealing with a very small company, you'll be dealing with, the CEO is hiring people. If the CEO is good at hiring, then that may be a big win. If the CEO isn't good and isn't experienced at doing that, it may be disastrous. Because, I know in my own case, my basic principle is, if I've hired for a type of role 2 or 3 times, the next time I hire for that role, I'm probably going to get it right with decently high probability. The first time I hire for a role, or if I change the type of person, the type of background and so on, a person that we're putting in a particular role, it's hard to get it right the first time. And that's a challenge both for the company and for the person being hired, because the best case is it's right on both sides and everybody's happy. If you sort of don't have the experience to get it right, then there's a problem there. Let's see. Oh boy, so many questions. All right, I should wrap up fairly soon. I could actually go back to my let's see. Gosh, a lot of specific questions here. question here from Joe. Do I have an ideal ratio of splitting time between working in the business as opposed to working on the business? So I guess what you mean by that is in the business is like pushing things forward, building products, things like that. On the business is kind of building the structure of the business as such. I think it probably depends on the age of the company and the stage that you're at. I mean, our company is a it's been sort of, it's a 35-year-old company. We've got a fairly stable structure. At the beginning, or at times when we build new businesses, I'm spending most of my time, if I'm involved with building that new business, well, for me, usually when I'm building new things, there's a lot of actual content of product building and things like that. But that's a time when one is intensely having to figure out how to build the structure of the business, so to speak. Like, for example, the things we're trying to do with NFTs right now, that's something that I'm kind of remiss in not spending more time on it, but it's something where to make that move, I understand something about the product side of it and so on. Now it's a question of, okay, I've got to start making phone calls and doing things and trying to figure out people and putting together teams and things like this. It's a project that's kind of a funny project because it's kind of a project where I'm off doing basic science, figuring out things about why our universe exists and very fundamental things about the nature of mathematics and so on. That's kind of one part of my life. There's another part of my life where I'm building practical software, and that's kind of deeper tools related kinds of things. And then for me, it's just kind of fun to have something that's why I'm thinking about this NFT thing. It's an interesting opportunity, and it's something where it has some sort of intellectual tentacles that I find quite interesting. And it's just kind of fun because it's different. And one of the things I've discovered about stuff I've done in my life is that the thing that's fun and different is the thing that kind of really tends to add sort of the energy that feeds back into the other things you're doing. It's like you could go on doing, this big product you've been building for a long time, and there's a certain, or you could go on doing physics that you've been doing for a long time or whatever, and there's a certain kind of inertia of you're on this track, you're doing what you're doing the thing. But then you do something and you're just doing it for fun. And it's like suddenly the thing you're doing for fun, you say, oh, actually there's deeper things that come in here, and this is how it connects, and so on and so on and so on. And the thing that you did for fun kind of added light to the other things that you were doing, which were just sort of a big industrial kind of, walking forwards. You may be very efficient in doing that big sort of industrial walking forward, but the thing you just do for fun, the thing that sort of starts as your hobby, so to speak, then to me, those have been the things that have led me to sort of the highest innovation and often the highest value activities that I've done. But once one's doing one of those things, when one's saying, okay, we're going to actually build this thing, well, there's a part that is defining the structure of what has to be built product-wise and so on. And there's defining the business structure around that, which is not a completely different problem. The only thing is, instead of lines of code, you're typically dealing with people. And, instead of assembling sort of a design for a piece of code with this function and that function, you're designing sort of a structure. We're going to have this group. Like today, for example, I invented, a new group that I think we should have at the company that has it's just a new factoring of the activities we have. It's sort of a new bucket, and once we have that new group, then we'll think about a bunch of things that fit into that group, and we'll do a bunch of things that we should have been doing anyway, but that were kind of in little cracks in different places between other groups. And so I think that's thinking about those kinds of things is something which, particularly when one's building new businesses, is something that takes a larger fraction of the time. I would say for me, one of the things for me, which is sort of a confusing thing for me, is that I'm pretty experienced at this point at doing these kind of business structuring and so on kinds of things. I mean, I've been basically involved in running businesses for, 42 years or something now. That means, and a thing that was very confusing to me at the beginning was I didn't know I had any aptitude for this kind of thing at all. The only thing that, I would just let's apply common sense and sort of basic analytical thinking to these questions about how to structure some piece of some business or whatever else. And what I discovered is that, by golly, I could actually figure out a not totally silly answer a decent fraction of the time. So for me, it kind of has always seemed rather easy. Not to say I haven't made mistakes, I've made plenty, but it's always seemed like a thing that wasn't a big, it's so confusing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, there's a thing to do, sometimes takes a while to figure out, but there's and so for me, it's perhaps a confusing thing because the fraction of time I spend doing sort of business structuring is lower than it might otherwise be because A, I'm pretty experienced, and B, I think I might have some aptitude that I didn't know I had for that kind of thing from the beginning, so to speak. So absent those two factors, I would probably spend more of my time doing those types of things. But at some level, building businesses, it's about sort of building, it's like doing software design. It's like you're having to, what's the structure? What are the groups? How do they, what is the, how do you define the objectives? And then the raw material is not code, but people typically. And then it's like, how do you fit this set of people together to achieve this objective? How do you figure out, and it's kind of like when you're doing building technology, it's like you have to make an assessment. Should I use this algorithm or that algorithm? When it's building teams, it's like, should I have this person or that person involved in this team? Same types of issues. And sometimes it's like, well, it's complicated. You're going to put together a team of 5 people and it's like you have to, have these different components in the team. And then you have to say, I don't know, in our company, we seem to be able to get most people can work with each other, although sometimes it's like those personalities are so unbelievably incompatible, but sometimes those are actually the best teams in the end. All right, I should wrap up in a moment. Maybe I'll take one more. There's a comment from Memes. How many companies live stream meetings on a frequent and regular basis? We may be the only ones. I don't know. Anybody know of any others? I mean, I started doing this a few years ago, because I thought it would be interesting, and why not? And it's turned out to be a really useful and valuable thing. I even find, I've been recording these. This is a crazy thing. I mean, this is these video work logs. So these are, you can find them on the web, particularly under the Physics Project. These are just when I'm just figuring stuff out and doing physics or whatever on my own. It's like I decided I'm going to just record that. And, maybe it'll be useful one day. Maybe it's absolutely dead useless. I can imagine it's useful. And I know people have used these things. It's like, how did you get that result that you put in this place? Oh, let's find it. It was at this moment, at this, this was the 10-minute period where you were developing this particular thing. You can find what was done. I found personally, it's sort of a funny psychological thing. I switch on this video work log recording thing, and I think I'm a little bit more focused than I would be if I didn't have that on. I kind of feel like, even though who knows, the recording might be lost. I have no idea. I don't know whether anybody's ever going to watch this. I don't know. I don't really care. But for some reason, it helps me just get a little bit more focused to be doing that. And I think for our internal meetings, I would say it's a little bit helpful in terms of focus. It's great in terms of comments from other people's getting comments from the audience, so to speak. That's very helpful. I would say for our own purposes and for training purposes and so on, it's very useful to record all these things. But the question that Memes is perhaps implicitly asking is, this is a question. This is a general question you might ask. If you say, I'm doing this and nobody else is doing it, there are two possible answers, two possible conclusions. I figured out something that's a pretty good idea and nobody's else has figured it out yet. Or, oh my gosh, what am I missing? There must be some disastrous problem with this idea. I mean, I remember when I became a remote CEO 30 years ago, people were like, you can't do that. That's never going to work. And of course, it works fine, as people know now. But it's, to me, I suppose I have enough confidence that if I'm doing something and I'm noticing, oh, look around, nobody else is doing this, I don't typically get the, oh my gosh, that means I must be doing something wrong. But who knows? Okay, there's some that we'll leave for another time, but there was a comment here about from Spencer. Would there be a value to developing a PhD equivalent for generalists instead of specialists? That's an interesting thought. What would it look like? What would it look like? I mean, it is, see, the problem is there's a certain value to deeply understanding anything, whatever it is. You study some obscure period of history, but you dig deep enough to really see what it feels like to actually do something that sort of digs deeper. And similarly, you know, when it's sort of a paradox, because you do a project, you have to build that tower tall enough. There's a lot you can see and learn by just building a tall tower, whatever the tower is about. And yet, it tends to be the case that people focus a lot, for example, in PhDs, on what is the tower about. And maybe maybe there's a certain sense. I mean, yes, I would say the following. Something people don't learn, usually in PhDing and things like that, is how to decide which tower to build. It's like, you know a lot about the mechanics of how to build the tower, but figuring out which tower is the right tower to build, figuring out the strategy of not how should you study something, but what should you study, is something that is never taught, never mentioned. It's like, if you have a good advisor, they'll suggest something or whatever, maybe they'll have a conversation with somebody, but the question of sort of what's the strategy for what to study isn't something that's taught. Now, of course, it can go the other way, and you can end up with these things where somebody will come up with the 7 rules of you know, inventing a new thing to study, and pretty soon, by the time it's that codified, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling, you know, a self-fulfilling failure of some kind. But there's a certain value probably to even, for example, if you've never seen a new thing could be come up with, that's a problem. If you've seen new things come up with and been involved in it and seen roughly how it works, that's useful. Yeah, so I mean, I think there are probably activities that involve sort of coming up with a bunch of projects and seeing how they work out and so on that are useful. I don't know. It's a good thing to think about. I haven't. It's a good question, and you see, the thing is, when you look at sort of educational results, people will go through all kinds of different educational tracks and wind up being great. Same track for somebody else, they'll be awful, at least for purposes of whatever it is, like we're trying to achieve at our company or something. And so it's, you know, there's a lot of the person interacting with the education track. The education track might enhance or suppress something, but I think it's yeah, it's a challenging thing. All right, that's a good that's a good thing. Yeah, there's a question. Okay, I think I should wrap this up here. I'm being told I'm really late for something. Parmenides is commenting, yeah, it's crazy that we stream all this stuff, but they say it's the best. Well, thanks. That's as I say, for us, it's been a win. I mean, you know, for me, you know, in sort of disclosure of like sessions like this one, for me, I always find it useful to try to explain things. And because I realize, you know, if you ask me, how do I think about this? How do I think about that? Well, if I never think about it, then, you know, it's like doing sessions like this one gives me, it sort of forces me to think about things that I might otherwise have just sort of, you know, been, oh, well, that's just a thing that flows by and I don't have to think about it. You guys are asking me all kinds of why, you know, what do you think about this? Well, how do you think about that? It's very helpful to me to kind of focus my thinking. And so that's why I'm doing this, because I find it fun and interesting. Hopefully other people find it interesting too. But that's the thing that I've sort of increasingly realized is that, particularly given the kinds of things I do for a living and I like to do, that involve sort of figuring out new things, the more I understand, the better off I am in doing that. Maybe there are other activities where that isn't so important, but for me, really understanding things is really quite important. And so having these opportunities to be put on the spot explaining things is very helpful to me. It's very useful for me in terms of building more things. And I'm sure if I look over the past couple of years, even last year, I'm sure if I go back and look that some of these sessions where I've been answering questions about science and technology or about business innovation and so on, I'm sure these have led to valuable, concrete ideas that I've then taken off in different directions. And so that's really a nice thing for me. All right, we should wrap up for now. Thanks for joining us, and see you. Hello there, welcome to another episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. So I'm happy to try and take questions about any of those topics. And I see we have quite a number saved up from before. Let's see. Oh, it's a question. See, you ask me difficult things here. Techrific asks me, what are my thoughts on GDPR and general hostility toward cloud technologies in the EU and so on? Boy, well, you know, there's always this challenge, and there has become a challenge in business of sort of, where does the value lie? What do you get paid for actually doing, and so on. And back in the day, it was sort of simple because people kind of made widgets, or they made physical things. They cost something to make. They sold them to people for more than they cost to make if they were lucky. And it was all quite simple. And then along came things like software, where the specific unit cost of making something is zero. When you do cloud computing, you know, cloud kinds of things isn't quite zero. But if you do, even when you're downloading software, it's not actually identically zero because it costs something to arrange for the download, but it's really close to zero. It's certainly nothing like the kinds of fractional costs that are involved in making physical objects. So, you know, that opened up all kinds of new potential models for how to do business, in which you're giving people things, you're not charging them for that, but you're getting the money somewhere else, and so on. And I mean, the classic examples of that are things like the kind of, you know, we'll provide a service and we'll make money by capturing user data, by using that to sell ads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where in a sense, the customer is not the customer, so to speak. The person who is using the social network or using the search engine or whatever is not the actual customer for the company that makes that thing. The actual customer for that company ends up being the advertiser or the outfit that wants data on the users and things like this. And it creates all sorts of strange incentives. And I think, you know, in my life in business, so to speak, you know, I've tried to keep the incentives as aligned as possible. That is, the things we make, the software we make, the technology we make that commercial by selling it to people who are going to use it, rather than some more complicated third-party kind of mechanism where we're giving things away and we're making money on ads or whatever else. Now, there are things we give away, like Wolfram Alpha, for example, where at least the web version, the basic web version of that, where I view that as being partly philanthropy and partly kind of a look at all the cool stuff we can do, use our other technology. It doesn't work so well for that particular purpose. It's I think people just say, thanks for giving this to the world, and that's, I'm happy with that too. Although it would be nice if it led more directly to people saying, oh, how does this Wolfram Alpha thing work? Maybe I should be using the technology behind it. That does happen at kind of the enterprise level, of people saying that it's a very good generator of kind of very interesting kinds of projects of, CEO of large company X sees Wolfram Alpha and says, why can't I do something like this of just asking natural language questions about our internal corporate data combined with sort of external data, and that's a good thing. But the issue that comes up when sort of the customer isn't the customer, one ends up with all kinds of issues, and some of these things about data privacy is one of the kinds of things that happens there. I think that what we have done, because it isn't our business to, let's say Wolfram Alpha queries, for example, it's not our business to go and do something where we're dealing with advertising and this, that, and the other. So it's always been rather simple for us. We can sort of keep queries private and throw away data and so on. It doesn't really make any difference. But if our model of business involved sort of the customers aren't the customers, but the customers are needing that data, then we've got a different situation on our hands. Now, I think that when people say that isn't good for our country or whatever, and our shouldn't be set up so that people capture this kind of data or that kind of data, then you've got then you've got the idea of, okay, let's put in a regulation that says you can't do this or can do that. Typically, these regulations tend to be rather blunt instruments, and there's obviously a giant industry in the world of when it comes to regulations about taxes or something like that. There's a giant industry of sort of figuring out what exactly is the regulation and how do we optimize things to be sort of skating on the side of that or whatever else. I think in my own observation about things like GDPR is that sort of what it might have been intended to do, I'm not sure it really achieved. I think there's this concept of sort of getting approval from a user. If you've got a big enough network with tentacles that reach far enough out, somewhere in your big enough network, there's some tentacle that will have given approval, and then the way that those rules were written, it sort of allows the whole octopus to have approval, so to speak. And the thing that I noticed when GDPR was coming in is that every EU-based kind of small charity and things like that was sending sort of panicked emails saying, help, please contact us, because otherwise we'll never be able to interact with you again. And I'm not sure that was a correct reading of the regulations, but at least that's what people thought was going to happen. So that was kind of to my mind, kind of a blunt instrument, which did not have the effect of sort of clipping the, I was going to say the wings of the octopus, but that's a bad analogy there. I don't think it had the effect of reining in sort of very large-scale data collection efforts, but did have the effect of causing trouble, at least, or concern on the part of smaller-scale operations. So I think this whole question about cloud technologies and centralization versus not, and so on, it's a strange thing because, when I started using computers back in the 1960s, early 1970s, there were, computers were big, they were expensive. Most computing was done in this kind of batch processing mainframe type mode, where there was a central computer, and everybody was using that same centralized computer. And then the personal computer revolution happened, and workstation computers came about, and so on, and everybody had their own computer. And now we're sort of more back to the situation where there's lots of centralized computing. And there are sort of reasons of economy of scale for doing that. I mean, if you take Wolfram Alpha, for example, we've got many, many terabytes of data about the world and so on. We've got all kinds of feeds that come in and all kinds of other things like that. And and in fact, for doing our natural language understanding and so on, we have to have lots of stuff in memory to do things efficiently. You need big computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It isn't in the current state of things. It's not realistic to have that be distributed to sort of everybody's personal computer. So that's one example of where centralization is useful. But also what's become increasingly clear in recent years is that kind of system administration and so on is complicated, and the centralization of that is a value. And that's a reason why people don't want to administer their own computers and so on. And so that's another reason to drive towards cloud kinds of things. I have to say that I've tended to avoid using those for services at our company, using sort of outside cloud services very much. I tend to think if you have a software company of a certain size and you have enough technical capabilities, it will end up being better and even cheaper to use your own in-house stuff, and perhaps safer to use your own in-house stuff than to have it all out there on somebody else's cloud, so to speak. But I think I'm not sure what the sort of critical point is. Maybe it's 500 employees, maybe it's a few hundred employees, maybe I don't know where it is, where it seems to me it's a little bit, it's not clear you need that particular economy of having, you're going to have your own system administration group, DevOps, team and so on in-house anyway. And so it doesn't really help you very much to just not happen to own the computers and so on. But I think a thing that there are certainly beliefs about the world of certain kinds of services where people say it's got to be centralized or it can't work. And it's sort of interesting to see that there's been a big trend towards, everything AI-ish must be centralized. And that's sort of, you've got to do sort of large scale training. You've got to pull in the data centrally and so on. I'm not sure that's really true. And I'm not sure that's a technological question. And I think, when it comes to different kinds of things in the world, it could have been the case that the web was completely centralized, that there was just, a computer somewhere that was sort of serving all websites, so to speak, or email could have been centralized. There's an email, system, and you could have said, you'll never be able to exchange email with people unless you had sort of one central email system somewhere in the world that was exchanging those things. But in fact, those systems got set up very well in a distributed way. In the current sort of social networks, for example, are very centralized. Not clear technologically, it doesn't have to be that way. That's been something that has been, I would say, more of a business optimization than has been a technology optimization. And that's something that has led to, all sorts of dynamics of tech companies bigger than countries, all these kinds of things. And it's not clear that it has to be that way, so to speak. There are economic forces that make that, that push one in that direction, but there are other things which might make one concerned about that direction. And I think that's sort of part of what one's seeing in, I think one of the things about cloud services is that as one sees those becoming centralized resources that are big and financially, commercially big, and sort of countries look at this and it's like, gosh, this is a big force in our world. And as a country, are we sort of giving something up by not somehow controlling what's going on with this? And you see that, in China, you certainly see that in the difficulty of, cloud services in China are very much not, we can't operate stuff there. It's difficult for, it's something where there's a definite set of regulations, from the government there. And I think that's something, as you look at that in different countries around the world, there are all sorts of different things that people talk about doing and have tried to do and so on with respect to sort of controlling this obviously increasingly important resource. It's worth remembering historically, it used to be the case that in most countries, the telecom systems were all government controlled. In England, where I grew up, it was the GPO. What would that stand for? General Post Office or something. I'm not sure that controlled. Gosh, I'm forgetting this. It's been so long. But the whole the phone network was all a government thing, whereas in the U.S., for example, it was a large private company, AT&T, and then later different pieces and so on. And I think that's been a sort of the realization that as one with the technology that's caused people, technology plus business that's caused this centralization, it becomes something that's sort of government level stuff. Now, how that relates to blockchain and the sort of government disconnected kind of world of government disconnected and very global world of sort of decentralized services, that's an interesting question. And it seems to be still, and that's kind of the opportunity to have something that is sort of separately set up. The concept that somehow there are commercial forces at work there as well, and what they will lead to, I think, is still not completely clear. And we've been quite involved in that. And there are questions like, for example, one that I've been interested in recently is how does blockchain relate to the future of software licensing? I think there are some really interesting things that can be done there. I think there are interesting things with respect to kind of the world of open source versus, again, our approach has been to have something which is fundamentally a piece of it's a proprietary software system where what we are doing is to make, we're producing something where we're selling it to people who use it. And that's been a very good and effective way to kind of get us a setup where we can continue to do R&D now for 35 years on that product, is to have something where the sort of the ecosystem is that's sort of been built is one where the people who are using our stuff are paying us to make more of our stuff, so to speak, rather than we made something and actually the less well it works, the better, because we're really making money selling services or some such other thing. For me, it's a much simpler setup, and one that leads one, I think, to generate more effective kind of innovative value for the world. But there's sort of a question of how in that setup, what is the best way to, for example, deliver final value? How do people sort of who are developing things with our technology, how do they most benefit, and other ways to do that using kind of blockchain type ideas and so on. Let's see. Aaron is saying that I'm looking better groomed today than I have been. I think yes, I was. It's one of these things where I suppose it's sometimes there's a certain question of how carefully do you need to have that fine suit. I think I barely own a suit. I think I do own one. But how important is it for one to make the right impression with the right kind of tie and so on? I remember a chap I knew who actually was he had a double life. He both ran a large academic organization and sort of had a separate life of working with investment funds and so on. And I think I was the only person in his sort of world who knew about both parts of his life, and he was always nervous about particularly the academic side of his life, finding out that he really was off doing these things with investments. But he particularly enjoyed telling me, for this kind of meeting with in this world you wear this color of tie, for that kind of meeting in that world you wear that color of tie. But I think somehow perhaps the world has evolved to a point where these things in most industries make less of a difference. Although I'm always interested to see, some kinds of industries, everybody's wearing a dark suit or the analog, and In other places, almost there's a sort of a there's equally well sort of the casual uniform of different kinds of things. I'm not sure that is. I suppose I end up personally tending to be a none of the above type character when it comes to, you know, is this person classified as a this or a this or a this or a this? And so I think I have the theory that I get to make up my own rules about that. So I don't pay as much attention to it perhaps as I might. You know, I think for some reason, maybe, you know, well, it's not something where, like, my wife is not telling me, oh, you're looking totally shaggy, you should go get a haircut. Maybe some people's spouses are more do that. Mine doesn't happen to do that. So let's see. And is asking, talking about the perception of CEOs within their own companies and in the public eye, how does one maintain leadership and reputation when people rely on one's decisions? You know, those are interesting questions. I think one of the things is there's a certain, I'll give you an example. Well, okay. The first question is, well, you know, you're often, you have to make decisions, you have to, and often you're doing that with incomplete information, and you're not absolutely certain you've got the right answer. I think one thing I've noticed is, so long as your level of certainty is reasonably high, it's better to just say, you know, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it, et cetera, rather than, oh, I'm not really sure, et cetera, et cetera. When the level of certainty goes down enough, it's really important to say, look, you know, there are two things we could do here, and we're going to do this one, but that might not be the right answer, it might be the other one. But there's no point in saying of every decision, oh, you know, there's a possibility that I'm wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a very, it's not a great way to, I think most people don't really, you know, they're perfectly happy. Decision's been made, they're going to do something sort of under that decision, so to speak, and it's fine to do that going forward. I think that there are cases where you're pretty certain, you know, that there's a 40% chance you're wrong. Well, don't just jump forward and say, we made this decision. It's only fair to the people involved to basically say, look, this is the decision we're going to make, but it could well not be the right decision. But I think, you know, so I think that there's a certain degree of just do a definite thing. Now, I've seen plenty of cases in my life where, you know, I'm kind of worried because things are kind of complicated and there's some turmoil about something and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've noticed that people really do appreciate it when one just says, this is what we're going to do. And, you know, there are all kinds of things and there's a worry about this and it might be that or whatever. But it's like there's a sort of, I think people appreciate so the definitiveness of this is what we're going to do and let's work out all the consequences of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think that we'll give you another example of an issue. So back in the day, I used to, you know, I like to know everybody who works at our company. That's not all that realistic with the number of people we have. There's maybe 800 people or something. It's and certainly since I've been a remote CEO for 31 years, I'm not like wandering around, you know, different offices and things. And we're a very geo-distributed company anyway. But either if I'm wandering around the office in person or for a little while, I had a telepresence robot that worked rather poorly actually for wandering around the office. So, you know, back in the day, I, you know, really used to make a point of wandering around, talking to people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I noticed an example of a thing that goes wrong is you'd think, you know, I like to know people who work at our company, not least because I'm always interested in seeing talent develop. And, you know, there's some tremendously talented junior person who really could be moved into some more sort of higher position, so to speak, in some different place, and they've obviously got lots of talent and so on. And it's good to be able to notice that. But one of the flip sides of that is you go around, you chat with people, you're chatting with somebody, and you're like, they're telling you what they're working on, and you get all interested in one particular aspect of it. And next thing you know is the manager or the manager of the manager of that person is complaining, how come you told that person to concentrate on doing this rather than the main part of their job type thing? And that's kind of okay, not such a good idea. Difficult to a difficult kind of, you have to be sort of careful in what you do in those kinds of communications, because you set up a whole structure for making the organization run, and to sort of jump in and derail some piece of it unless something has gone very wrong there. Something's gone very wrong there, then you sort of have to do that. But if it hasn't, there's no, that's sort of a bad thing to do. And I think another piece of perhaps, I don't know, there's sort of unexpected aspects of I think one often sort of leads by example, and I tend to be, I work very hard, and I tend to be quite, I tend to push myself to do all sorts of difficult things, and I push other people to do all sorts of difficult things as well, and that seems to me to make sense. I kind of like to believe that I'm not kind of telling people, oh, go do this thing, when I would never do that myself, or could never do that myself. I think it's much better to be sort of encouraging people and asking people to do things where it's like, well, I wouldn't mind doing that myself, but I can't do all these things. So it's like, you get to do that thing rather than me, so to speak. I think that there are all kinds of questions about what one should delegate versus not. And one of the things that is sometimes difficult in learning to do management is, what should you delegate? Now, there are situations where people say, I have no choice but to delegate. I don't know anything about that particular thing that I'm delegating about. I have to say, I don't think that's the best situation. I've certainly found in my own life that things that I really don't understand, where I'm sort of delegating them to somebody else, it's that doesn't go nearly as well as things which I basically understand, even though I might not have all of the details, and I'm certainly not going to put all the time in to working all of the things out. But it's easier to delegate well if you understand the things you're delegating, and could, in principle, go do that job if you had to, so to speak. But there's also the question of, you can do something well. Okay, you delegate it to somebody else. They maybe are not as experienced. They can't do it quite as well. What's the relative value of the time you save by delegating versus the loss of quality of execution, for example, that you get by having somebody other than you do it? Or maybe it's an increase in quality of execution because that person's really pretty good at doing it, or they're going to put more effort into it, or whatever else. But that's a thing which I would say over the years, I've gotten better at figuring this out, but it's not a simple thing. And there's particularly one of the paradoxes of that is that as one oneself gets more experienced, it becomes faster to do many kinds of things that one might otherwise be delegating to do them oneself, because one has the experience, I just do boom, 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 this is what I can do. And so for me, for a long time, I had taken the point of view, first of all, I sort of have a point of view that if I can delegate, I should delegate, because there's plenty that I cannot delegate. And so if it's delegatable, try and delegate it. But then the thing that can go wrong is you delegate something and it's really hard. It turns out it's really much harder than expected. Turns out there's some horrible, problem that you just can't get, the people you delegated to just can't get resolved. The thing you have to do is make sure that can come back to you, that they don't just try and sort of noodle around thinking about it for 3 months and then, oops, we couldn't figure it out, sorry, type thing. But that they don't get, that they're not don't feel bad about saying, look, this is pretty difficult. Can you help us figure this out? I think I consider myself to have succeeded in some ways in management when I do get people coming back to me and saying, this turned out to be much harder than you thought. What did you imagine was actually going to happen? And I look at it and like, yeah, you're right. I should have figured that out, but I didn't. It's much more difficult. Let's go try and figure it out. And sometimes I used to think that in cases where I sort of had to parachute in or decided to parachute in and try and solve some problem that had been a big festering problem somewhere, that people would be like, oh my gosh, we'll never be able to learn how to do anything because the CEO is always going to parachute in and solve all the difficult problems, or nobody would ever sort of try solving difficult problems themselves. But in fact, that isn't what's happened. Instead, I think people are maybe even charmed that I'm prepared to go in, and I know we just started actually a more formalized system of when there are sort of bugs and things that have just been rattling around for a really, really long time, that I've sort of signed myself up to say, okay, I'm going to try and solve these. And I've so far, we'll see if it continues, but the times when we've had this sort of formalized process now for doing this, the times I've ended up doing it, it turns out, yes, I actually managed to solve it, or at least get us on a track to being able to solve it. And, how can I do that? Well, I've had lots of experience by now. I also know about a lot of different kinds of things, and a lot of cases where there's some nasty problem, bug, issue, whatever, the thing is not going to be solved by just drilling with what in one particular area. One's going to have to think more globally about what's possible. I mean, I would say another thing about delegating things that can get difficult is you imagine this is what we should do. Some particular thing should get done. And so you say to somebody, can you do this particular thing? Well, it turns out that particular thing is really difficult. But unless you explain why you care about that particular thing, the person will just keep drilling. Can I do that particular thing? If they knew why one cared, they might be able to say, hey, wait a minute, if we do something just a tiny bit away from that, it'll be easy. If we redefine what this product is supposed to be just a little bit, we redefine what this function is supposed to do, whatever else it is, by just a little bit, we've got an easy path. But if you just sort of, fire and forget delegated that thing, and the person will go off and try and make it work, and it often, that's a bad thing. And so, I certainly like to try when I'm delegating things to explain why we're doing what we're doing. Some people, depending on their background, depending on what the kinds of topics are, some people will really understand that well, and some people will be like, just tell me what to do. And then without understanding that stuff. And it's certainly better, I think, but of course, the other thing that can happen is if you explain too much why you're doing something, the person will be like, oh, well, maybe we should do it differently. We should do this, we should do that, we should do the other thing. It's like, look, I kind of figured out what we should do. I'm pretty sure this is right. Just go try and do this. Don't spend a lot of resources, don't spin a lot of wheels, kind of rethinking what I think I already figured out. That's just a waste of time, so to speak. So, but the pure kind of just do this and ask no questions, so to speak, is not great. But nor is the let's noodle over the decision for 3 weeks and never get anything done. And sometimes, I always notice when there's a certain type of thing that I'll give somebody or some group or something to do, and no questions come back. I'm always like, something's wrong here, because I know that there are going to be issues. And, and there are, it's for me, at least, it's easier when there are too many questions and you have to tell people, as I've done many times, like, look, you're asking me these questions, you ask me this question. What do you think the answer to that question is? They tell you. You say, yeah, that's right. Okay, the next, rather than asking me that question, asking me questions over and over again, it's like, you're at the point where you're going to be able to get the right answer most of the time. You don't need to ask me. And sometimes people will still keep asking a bit, but I think it's an important thing to communicate to people, the point when they really don't have to ask you because you're going to agree with their answer most of the time. And what you hope for is that there are times when people will, and many people I work with and worked with for many years, have sort of know well at what point they know what they know, and they know what they don't know, and they know what they kind of want to ask me and so on, and what they don't need to ask me about. So at least that's that kind of thing. Now, I mean, I suppose that it, in terms of leadership, and it really helps when one can actually do stuff oneself. And in our particular organization, we basically don't have any sort of pure managers, so to speak. The people who are leading things are also doing things, I suppose that's I'm a big example of that, because I'm actually doing software design. I'm doing a bunch of sort of basic science and R&D and so on. I'm doing a whole bunch of writing. I'm doing a fair amount of kind of outside presentation of things, although I don't get involved in the kind of the nitty-gritty of our commercial operations. I kind of made that as a principle for our company many years ago, that I could spend all of my time, because that's a typical thing that a person who's leading a company like ours would do. I could spend all of my time, meeting with customers and doing commercial kinds of things. And I said, I'm simply not going to do that. That's something I'm going to delegate. I hope I can find good people to do that. But it's a sort of a life decision that I'm going to concentrate on the sort of making products, figuring out things strategically, so to speak, rather than on the kind of the sort of person-to-person type aspects of the commercial things that we have to do. Let's see. Well, PJ is asking, have I ever felt that I was working on too many projects at one time? They say they're developing 3 different products right now, but is one project at a time better in your experience? I think if you're doing it just yourself, for me, and people may vary on this, but for me, I cannot deal with a huge number of high intensity projects at the same time. I much prefer to push to get a project done. That one's finished, go on to the next one. Because for me, I'm building up a lot of kind of internal state information as I work on some particular thing with intensity. And if I try and sort of, if I try and kind of switch to something different, I lose a lot of that state. So I like to be kind of a sequential worker. Now, when you're working with other people, that's often not possible. And so what my life tends to be, I'm working on some particular thing myself with high intensity, and then I'm working myself with maybe people helping me on that project. But then there are lots of other projects that I'm involved in kind of providing leadership for, but they're projects which, if I disappear for a month, those projects still have a path that they're keeping going on. They're not projects where I'm pulling them, forward. They're projects that are under their own steam, but I'm kind of helping to direct them rather than being the one who's actually pulling them step by step to the next piece. I think that when a project can be something where you can feel like, even if I do nothing for a month, even things will have happened with that project, then those are ones that I feel like I can do in parallel with others. Where there are ones where it's like my personal effort is needed every single day to make this project move forward, those are ones where I tend to try and do them sequentially, so to speak. Now, I think one of the things that can happen, is very frustrating actually, is that you're doing one of these ones that's sort of a high intensity project, but it needs a sort of sub piece. And that sub piece relies on other people, and that sub piece isn't under your control. I can work as hard as I want. I can, I can work hours and hours and hours, days and days and days on it. It's not going to do any good, because that part is being done by other people. And for whatever reason, they're not going to deliver their results for another week, 2 weeks, whatever else it is, month, whatever. In fact, I'm right now, just this week, in the middle of such a situation where there's a project, some very good people are working on sort of a piece of it, trying to bring it to completion. It's a very abstract project, big project about mathematics and the kind of a sort of a realization that we can make kind of a bit of progress on something which has been kind of in some direction for the last 100 years or so. I think we have a somewhat different direction, but this is a big project. It's a couple of 100-page document, and it's in the stage of sort of cleaning up all of the graphics and code and things that goes into it. And I've kind of finished my part, and there's a bunch of cleanup to be done, but then I have to come back in and sort of try and make sure everything is consistent at the end. And so I'm in kind of the state of I'm waiting for other people who are doing very well at it, but it's, you know, I'm just waiting. And so I literally had to make this decision last weekend. Do I start another project even as this one is not finished, or do I sort of put myself in a wait state until that project is finished? Because that project just requires a huge amount of kind of internal state for me to remember what's going on with it, and for me to sort of do a good job of finishing it off. So in the end, I decided I did start looking at another project, and decided I'm not going to do this. I'm going to take, you know, I always accumulate vastly too much email. I get many hundreds of messages per day. And what ends up happening is I sort of triage off the ones that are fairly simple to respond to. And then there's this collection of compacted email that builds up that is sort of progressively more and more difficult, and progressively requires more and more effort to respond to. And, you know, at a good time, I'll maybe have 500 compacted messages. At a bad time, my sort of total pending messages will go up into the 3,000-4,000 range. And then I have all this sort of personal analytics data where I can see, I find it rather satisfying to look at the plot of, you know, pending email, and you can see all these big cliffs when I really worked very hard to get it down and so on. But so I decided I would do that. So people who might have been, I think the earliest email I responded to was from 2008, although most of it is from the last year or so. So that was my kind of something I had to get done sometime. And that was what I sort of did in order to avoid myself getting diverted from knowing about this one project that I'm trying to get finished. As soon as that project is finished, you know, the day it's finished, I'll go on and start another project. I think, so for me, it's easier to do things somewhat sequentially when I am the driving force. When there are other people providing leadership for the project, that's not necessary, and it's much more efficient to run a bunch of things in parallel. So that's my comment on that. There's a question here about from JT about what's my ideal business size? How many employees is there a sweet spot? You know, I think companies go through, there are different things that happen at different sizes. Like below 50 people, you kind of know everybody. You know, below, I don't know, 20 people or something, everybody's sort of special and different, and there are many sort of single points of failure. When you're down at sort of, you know, 5 people or something, it's a much more personal experience with people. When you get above maybe, I don't know, a few hundred people, 500, I don't know, a few hundred, there, if you have things set up properly, there are rather few single points of failure. You know, there are rather few places where, oh gosh, nobody could pick up that thing if that person disappeared or whatever. I think from a CEO point of view, there's probably, I don't know how many people I directly work with. I'm sure I have that data, but I'm guessing it's, I don't know, 50, 100, maybe 150 or something, people that I'm routinely in meetings with and things like this. And then there's, you know, another, I mean, our company is like 800 people altogether. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who are part of those organizations and are doing, you know, super valuable work, but it's just like, I'm not interfacing directly with them. And so at some level, there could be more of those people, and it would be invisible to me as, you know, as a CEO, so to speak. And I think the things that then tend to happen is the more people there are, I think, you know, 800 is the largest of a company I've I've run, so I can't speak from personal experience for larger companies. I can only talk about things I've seen and things friends of mine deal with in running larger companies. I think sort of the difficulty of turning the ship and so on changes as the company gets bigger, and the kinds of issues that you run into change. When you're really and the level of sort of precision that you have to operate at with respect to all kinds of structuring kinds of things changes. The extent to which everything has to have certain levels of bureaucracy and this and that and the other changes as you change the size of the company. And I think for me, I'm pretty happy at the size of company we have, which is partly why that's the size of company we have. It's sort of, for me as a CEO, it's kind of small enough that I've I think got my arms more or less around the things we do. There are not lots of tentacles here and there where it's like, oh, I never knew what that business unit did. Oh, we have a business unit doing that. I didn't know that type thing. That doesn't really happen at a company of our size. If our company had, 10,000 employees, I'm sure there would be plenty of pieces where I would say, oh gosh, I had no idea we did that. And I suppose for me personally, with my particular interests in building things and products and so on, it's in a sense it's better to have a company that's small enough that it has to be large enough that it can get a lot of stuff done, and yet small enough that you can kind of see to the edges of the thing, and it's not kind of a thing where there's sort of a business unit where you didn't know what it did. Now, again, there are things that happen. I mean, I think our company should be bigger than it is. Probably it should be probably twice the size it is right now. And it's a question of I've been operating kind of a simple private company without investors or anything like that for the last 35 years. And one feature of that is it's kind of like you have to spend less than you make, and that limits the rate at which you can grow. And even in times where things are sort of where revenues go up and everything looks very rosy, it's kind of like I tend to take the rather conservative point of view of don't bring on board lots of people where you can't tell what's going to happen if things aren't as rosy next year type thing. And that's turned out to be a good strategy for the last 35 years. But I think the other question about how big a company should you have is what is the company supposed to do? What functions? I mean, like, for example, you take our company, you could say, well, why don't you have more people working on this or that thing? Well, we don't really know what we want to do on this or that thing. So we could pour more people into it, but they wouldn't do anything terribly useful because it's like, that we don't have a clean enough strategy in that area to know what we should do. Now, there are things where it's obviously scalable. Like we could say, I don't know, let's say versions of Wolfram Alpha. We have ones in a few languages. We could say, let's get versions of Wolfram Alpha in another 20 languages. And it's clear we could bring in teams of people, we could do that. Whether each of those languages would be a commercial success, given what we'd have to spend to make them, it's not clear, but it's clearly something where, in a sense, you turn the knob, you get more stuff done. It's well defined what has to be done. And but there are other places where you could say, well, let's have more sales folk working on this or that thing. Well, to do that, you have to have more leads. Let's do this thing. And it can be something that can happen, particularly in more commercial areas, is that you say, gosh, let's just bring on board a much bigger sales team because then we'll sell more. Well, it turns out that's not the only problem you need to solve to sell more. But if you bring on board all those people, you're paying for all those people. And that can be really bad if you didn't solve the whole problem of how do you make that work. So, people say, and I think it also depends, optimal size of company also depends a bit on, what the mission of the company is and what the CEO's personal goals are, what the CEO can actually reasonably handle, and so on. I think for us, I'm pretty happy with the size of company we have, although I think it should be maybe a factor of 2 bigger, but not a factor of 10 bigger, because I think then we're in the hey, do we really have a division that does that? I didn't know that. Which, for my kind of CEOing, I find, I'm not that interested in that. There are people where the primary goals are much more directly, purely commercial, where it's like, oh, we have a division that does that and it makes money, fantastic. That's let's have more of those type thing. Whereas for me, if we have a division that does that and it's something I just don't care about, not something I find interesting, then that's a thing where it's not, that doesn't that's not something I'm motivated to add in, so to speak. Now, of course, we're also in the situation where we don't have outside investors and things like that, where we're not trying to make money for other people, so to speak. We're kind of in a good situation in some ways, that we're able to just serve ourselves and our customers in the world, so to speak, rather than specifically, oh, we've got to make sure that the market analysts like us so that our stock price goes up, type thing. And different people are under different constraints in respect of that, and particularly people who've brought in venture capital investment, things like this, have a different set of objectives that they are signed up to answer for, so to speak. So again, that can be, sometimes there's a value to having, when people just are just hiring tons and tons of people, sort of almost for the sake of having a bigger company, that tends to not end well. And sometimes when there's like, oh, we just got all this investment money, we've got to scale up and have all these people, unless you really know what they're going to do, that's sort of a crazy thing to do, although people do it all the time. It's like, can you really figure out what all these people are going to do? Are they really going to do something where you can tell that having more people doing that is actually going to lead to a better result? I mean, it's a famous claim about software development, that sort of just throwing more people on the problem can slow down rather than speed up software development. That's a question of sort of how you're managing it, and there are plenty of places where sort of adding more people forces more bureaucracy, which slows the whole thing down. But on the other hand, there are other places where it's like you've just got more to do, and so you need more people to do it, and where it's a scalable thing that you've defined. Let's see. There's a question here from JT. What's your rule of thumb about changing your mind? I do change my mind. I consider it one of my better attributes. I think that it is, having said that, I might be seen as being quite stubborn about things. I think here's the principle. I believe that I can understand, quotes, anything. Very arrogant statement. But it is my, that's the way I kind of lead my life, is I expect to understand things. And when people say, oh, I'm an expert, you should do this or that or the other, it's like, let me understand that. And say, oh, no, you'll never understand it. It's like, no, I've understood a lot of stuff. I can learn about it. Let me understand it. Tell me why you're saying that. And, I think it's a very worthwhile skill to have gotten to the point where you understand when you understand. And you're used to understanding things. So you're used to being kind of on that bedrock of personal understanding. And I'm not used to being in a situation where I'm sort of floating on there are words and you're saying this and you're saying that, but I don't really understand it, but I've still got to do things even though I don't understand it. I'm not used to that. I'm used to being sort of on a bedrock of personal understanding and being able to get to the point where I really have that. And that makes it much easier to know sort of when should you change your mind? Maybe, because you really understand it. It's not like, oh, this person's saying this and that person's saying that, and I trust this person more than I trust that person. Because then you're sort of floating and you're kind of relying on all kinds of things. But at least for me, it's like, I really need to understand it. Once I really understand it, I can realize, and sometimes it's useful to me to say, okay, I really understood this, and by golly, I got it wrong. And now when I've got sort of plan B and I'm going to go in that direction, it's like, well, let me understand, why did I get it wrong? And I can understand that too. And once I can see, well, I got it wrong because I didn't know this one thing. You know, there's something about the way that that kind of thing works, you know, some industry works or some type of world situation or some technological thing works. I just didn't know. And so I got it wrong. And I can understand why I got it wrong before. And that gives me confidence in changing my mind and doing something different now. Now, you know, having said that, there are things where people will say things to me, you know, you should do this, you should do that, company should do this, we should do this thing. And I will perhaps stubbornly say, no, I don't agree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have some framework for thinking about things where that just doesn't make sense to me at that time. And sometimes it may take years before I kind of evolve to the point where my ambient understanding of things is such that, yeah, I remember this person told me that, you know, 10 years ago, and by golly, they were right and I was wrong. And I suppose one thing that's important about that is, I don't know, I have, I suppose, enough personal confidence that, you know, look, I'm not worried that, I'm not embarrassed by the fact that, you know, the person told me that 10 years ago, they were right, I didn't see it. Now I realize that they were right. Okay, great. You know, good for them. You know, kudos to them. I'm happy. I don't feel terribly, oh, I'm so embarrassed, I was such an idiot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I think that recognizing one makes mistakes and why one makes mistakes. I mean, I suppose my self-confidence is such that I might make a stupid mistake, but at least I want to be able to understand my stupidity, so to speak, and that I'll be able to do that. So I think that's, but I think it is one thing within an organization about people changing their minds and so on, is that there are situations in which you just don't want to push people into, you got to take a position on this, because people will dig themselves in, and, you know, and then there'll be a huge sort of pride factor of, no, we really don't want to change what we're saying. And, you know, we were really right the first time and so on. And it's often much better from a management point of view to just not push for that, not push people into that kind of polarized situation, to not have them have to have an opinion about this or that thing that the company is doing. Just don't, it's not part of their world. You don't have to talk to them about it. Just do that. And when it becomes important for them to be involved, then hopefully things will have clarified and they won't sort of take that, take a polarized position a different way. I mean, a sort of classic example in the history of our company was when we were developing Wolfram Alpha. I have to say that some of my senior management was, I pretty much was sure that they would not believe in Wolfram Alpha. And the early demos that we had were pretty pathetic. I mean, before we had our whole computational knowledge engine working, it was like, you'd ask one question, it would work. You'd ask the next question, it would be a total splat. It was a thing where to make it a real thing, you had to have, you had to have carried this big thing a long way up the hill, so to speak. It wasn't possible to see little pieces of it and have it be credible, so to speak. So I made a sort of I actively decided I'm not going to expose this to my management team, and I'm kind of going to, in the end, it was a little bit ridiculous because we were kind of hiding a few hundred people working on a project, and I was kind of not bringing it up very much. And that was a really good decision, because I know that had that been discussed, people said, oh, let's see a demo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really stupid. This is never going to work. And there would have been all kinds of internal pushback and people being very polarized about it and so on. And as it was, by the time it was basically finished and demoable and I could show it to people, it's like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And, you know, everybody's excited about it. But in its embryonic phase, it was much more difficult to expose to people. I suppose that's a thing that happens quite a bit in sort of innovative projects, is if you expose them to people who are, you know, very capable managers doing their thing, building, whatever they're building or running whatever they're running, and you show them sort of an embryonic thing, there's a great tendency to say that's an embryonic thing, it's never going to work, it's this, and this. And part of the story of trying to run an innovative organization is you kind of have to navigate that and not sort of feed sort of these ill-formed embryonic projects to not expose them to everybody until they've gotten to a point where people can really see what they are and where it's possible to have a more informed opinion rather than just sort of poking at little pieces of them to see what's going on. Let's see. Chap asks, comments that my record of being a work from home CEO is rather unique, and they're asking, has the pandemic changed my CEOing habits? The one thing that has changed is video. I have used screen sharing for, I don't know, 30 years or something. And I've been, audio plus screen sharing. That's my way of doing meetings and things like that. And that's been that way for 30 years as I've been a kind of remote work from home CEO. The one thing is that in this pandemic, as partly through sort of a desire to make sure that people felt like there was some degree of personal interaction when there wasn't much in their sort of everyday life, kind of started using video more, and I don't use it. I don't use it that much, but I do use it from time to time. And there's certain kinds of meetings that in the past would have been pure audio that I now find it useful to have video. I know some managers in our company are always like video crazy, and they're like, everybody's got to be on video, and I'm not that way. But that's been the one thing that's substantially changed, I would say. I mean, the other